You've heard of all the theories about landing on the moon, right? The flag fluttering in the void. The shadows are inconsistent, as if they were made in a studio. The absence of stars in the lunar sky. The perfectly detailed footprints in a moisture-free terrain, among others. What if all of this was just the tip of the iceberg? What if there were deeper, more shocking accounts from people who were behind the scenes, working inside NASA? People who saw confidential documents, participated in secret meetings, and witnessed events that the world was never supposed to know about? Get ready to discover the truth. Today, we will reveal the dark stories of a former NASA employee who lived it all behind the scenes and who proves, through lived facts, that man never set foot on the moon. Secrets that do not involve theories, but real experiences. What he heard, saw, and experienced can completely change the way you see the story of the man on the moon. But first, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. And also, check out the gift we left for you in the pinned comments. A special bonus for those who want to delve even deeper into the mysteries they don't want you to know. The story begins as follows. I worked at NASA for over 15 years, and I never imagined that I would find myself in a situation where I needed to question everything I believed. My name, it doesn't matter. You can call me Tom to be safe. I'm going to share something that torments me to this day, the Apollo 11 project. It all started in 1967 when I was transferred to a little-known division of NASA. There were no signs indicating its location. The documents we signed on the first day were almost a lifelong silent contract. They said we were working on astronaut safety simulations, but I soon realized this was something much bigger. There was a room called the Black Room, with no windows and with equipment I had never seen before. Huge screens showed images of what appeared to be the lunar surface, but the detail was too absurd to be just a test. It was as if we were recreating the moon with cinematic perfection. There, I met a man, let's call him Richard, a special effects technician who, out of curiosity, had worked in Hollywood. He always joked, "I'm recreating the moon better than nature itself." I thought he was exaggerating until I saw him molding lunar mountains into a giant model. When I asked why we would do this, he laughed. "Do you really think we'll be able to land on the moon before the Russians? My friend, this is where we will win this war." What disturbed me most was that every advance we made was overseen by men who clearly did not belong to NASA. They wore expensive suits, spoke little, and had an almost intimidating authority. I once saw one of them arguing with the director of our department. The only thing I could hear was, "The president has already approved it. Just do as we ask." Meetings were always tense. We were shown a timeline, but never the end goal. Until, in a meeting in 1968, they finally explained, "We need to simulate all possible conditions of a lunar landing. Every detail must be perfect, from the footprints on the ground to the movement of the flag. The world cannot understand." At that moment, the air became heavy. It was as if everyone in the room knew what it meant, but no one had the courage to say it out loud. A few days later, I met a colleague who seemed very shaken. He told me that he had read a document entitled Apollo Alternative Plan, which described a scenario where the moon landing would be completely fabricated if the real missions failed. The question that plagues me is, if the alternative plan was so detailed, why were we putting so much effort into it? Had they already decided that the real landing would never happen? Shortly before leaving NASA in 1970, I received an offer to transfer to another division, away from all this. I refused. I knew too much, and I preferred to leave for good. But to this day, when I look at images from Apollo 11, I can't help but think about how strangely familiar those craters and shadows were. Maybe because I helped create them. It was as if I was living in a paradox. I knew something that could change the world, but I had no way to prove it. Until, years later, I came across something that confirmed all my suspicions. In 2006, it was reported that the original Apollo 11 mission tapes had been erased due to reuse to save space and resources. I laughed bitterly when I heard that. Why? Because I knew exactly what really happened. During my last year at NASA, I had access to a top-notch archive room where the original video and audio tapes were stored. I saw the tapes. These weren't just ordinary recordings. Some of them had strangely worded labels, such as emergency simulation, Apollo 11, audio test, moon base, and, most shockingly, visual record black room. I wasn't allowed to see the content, but curiosity got the best of me. One night, I took advantage of the fact that the supervisor was out and managed to reproduce one of them. What I saw on that tape still gives me chills. It was black and white footage from the same room where we worked on the Apollo 11 project. In the center was a detailed model of the moon, and around it were cameras and professional lighting. A man wearing an astronaut uniform walked around the scene, practicing movements. A stage manager gave directions. "Slow down, Neil. Make it feel heavier, like it has low gravity." I stopped the video immediately, scared of what it meant. It wasn't training, as they said. It was a recording that simulated a lunar landing, and they were trying hard to make it perfect. When I confronted a colleague about this, he asked me not to mention it to anyone. He said, "These tapes are not for the public. If you want to keep your career and your life intact, forget you ever saw them." He was right. A month later, I was transferred to a different project, and the file room was sealed. Years later, when the world was informed that the original tapes had been erased, I knew that this was a pretext to cover up any evidence of what had happened. A complete cleanup, which included not only the tapes, but also documents and reports related to the Apollo 11 project. You may be wondering, why didn't I say it before? Why didn't you bring this up? Because everyone who tried to expose the truth faced something much worse than just losing their jobs. I have heard of at least 3 colleagues who have mysteriously disappeared or had their careers destroyed. One of them, an engineer called Frank, told me, "If you open your mouth, they'll come after you and your family, and they won't hesitate." I chose silence for decades, but over time the guilt grew. Today I see these reports about how NASA lost critical data, and I think the world deserves to know what really happened. If they were able to destroy the original tapes, what else did they erase from history? I always wondered how they planned to make it all seem so real. After all, deceiving the entire world is not a simple task. It was then that I discovered the next phase of the project: secret training in the desert. Around 1968, I was ordered to accompany a group of technicians and engineers to a remote location. The destination, a deactivated military installation in the middle of the Nevada desert, close to the famous Area 51. Officially, our mission was to evaluate the behavior of equipment in extreme environments. But once we arrived, it became clear that this was much more than just testing. The first thing that caught my attention was the landscape. They had chosen an area that looked remarkably like the images we saw of the moon. Barren ground, artificial craters, and even carefully placed lighting to simulate the shadow and light conditions an astronaut would face on the lunar surface. I remember thinking, they're not just testing equipment, they're rehearsing a performance. The astronauts were there too, but what they did was not what I expected. Instead of focusing exclusively on using equipment such as the lunar rover or scientific tools, they repeated choreographed movements. They walked, simulated planting the flag, and even practiced slow falls as if gravity were low. I approached one of the supervisors and asked why they were doing that. He just said, "It's in case we need to use backup footage." It was the first time I heard the term backup footage. But what really shook me was what I saw in a secluded tent marked "Restricted Access." Curious, I peeked around the corner of the tarp and was shocked. There was a team of professional filmmakers there, adjusting high-precision cameras and testing different filters. The team leader, a man with a grey beard, was arguing with an engineer about how to make the shadows look more convincing. I never found out who he was, but rumors among staff suggested he had a connection to Hollywood. That same day, I witnessed something I will never forget. The astronauts, dressed in full spacesuits, were filming a scene in which they descended from a fake lunar module. The director gave detailed instructions. Remember, the steps must be slow. Always pretend you are fighting gravity. After several attempts, they finally got what looked like a perfect shot. Later, during a break, a technician working on lighting approached me. He looked exhausted and tense. He said, "Do you really believe we're going to the moon? They already know it won't happen. This is to keep America on top. If the Russians believe it, the rest of the world will too." At that moment, everything made sense. It wasn't about science. It was about politics. Rehearsals continued for weeks. Every detail was meticulously planned. Even the footprints in the sand have been carefully shaped to look authentic. One day, I saw an engineer arguing with a supervisor because the marks left by the astronauts were not deep enough. He said, "If we don't do this right, they're going to know it's fake." Most disturbing, however, was the visit from a high-ranking government official. He arrived by helicopter, accompanied by two men in suits who didn't say a word throughout the meeting. The officer just repeated, "This has to be perfect. We're not just representing NASA, we're representing the United States of America. Failure is not an option." When the training ended, we were all forced to sign new, even stricter confidentiality agreements. There was even a clause that mentioned threats to national security if any information was leaked. I never fully understood what would happen if we broke the silence, but from the serious looks on the supervisors' faces, it seemed like our lives were at risk. I returned from that desert with the certainty that something much bigger was happening. Everything I had seen, the simulations, the rehearsals, the veiled threats, pointed to one obvious conclusion. The moon landing was never about exploring space. It was a carefully planned operation to win the Cold War at any cost. Now, every time I see images of Apollo 11, I can't help but notice the similarities to that desert. The shadows, the craters, even the movements of the astronauts. It all feels incredibly familiar. Coincidence? I don't believe that anymore. After the weeks in the desert, I was assigned to work on an even more confidential project. I was taken to a facility called Area 14, which, from what I later discovered, was a hidden section of a larger base, supposedly linked to the famous Area 51. The place was so secret that not even the other NASA employees seemed to know of its existence. When I arrived, I had to go through a security screening that lasted hours. They made me sign new documents, and my access was limited to a specific set of areas. No one used real names inside. We were all identified by numbers. Mine was 0197, and that's what I came to be called. Upon entering the complex, I noticed something curious. There were no windows, and the lights were always artificial. The environment had a heavy, almost suffocating atmosphere, as if every corner of that facility hid a secret. The project I was assigned to was called Lunar Stage Development, but that was not scientific development. It was something completely different. Inside the facility, there was a room we called the theater. It was a huge space with black walls and an incredibly detailed replica of the lunar surface in the center. They had recreated the entire scene. The craters, the texture of the ground, even the lighting was adjusted to simulate the exact angle of sunlight on the moon. Everything was done with obsessive precision. I was tasked with monitoring the star projection systems. What I found strange was that these systems would not be used in an actual mission, but rather to create what they called controlled visual backgrounds. When I questioned why we needed this, my supervisor just responded, "It's to ensure visual recordings meet safety standards." I knew that was an excuse. One of the most impactful moments came when I saw the project director bring a group of men in dark suits on a tour of the facility. During the visit, one of the men asked something like, "Can this be broadcast live without fail?" The director replied confidently, "We've already done the tests. The signal delay will be integrated to simulate the distance to the moon. No one will notice." Another detail that bothered me were the reports we signed daily. They didn't mention anything about lunar missions or Apollo. Instead, the documents used vague terms such as Visual Confirmation Protocol and National Contingency Simulation. It was clear that this was all part of a bigger plan, something we couldn't question. Security measures were so strict that if anyone mentioned anything related to the project outside the facility, they were immediately investigated. A colleague of mine once disappeared without warning. The rumor was that he had said too much during an informal meeting outside of work. We never saw him again. One night during a break, one of the more experienced technicians approached me. He was visibly shaken and said, "Have you ever stopped to think that what we're doing here has nothing to do with science? This is theater, pure and simple. We are creating an illusion that the whole world will believe." He was right. This wasn't space research. It was a show. What shocked me the most was when I saw the astronauts entering Area 14. They spent weeks there, practicing their moves on the lunar replica. The American flag we saw in the broadcasts was there too, being tweaked repeatedly to make sure it looked perfect. During one of these practices, I heard one of them say, "This will convince even the most skeptical." Those words echo in my mind to this day. Area 14 was the heart of the operation. Everything the public saw, the images, the videos, the live streams, was created there. It was a perfect stage for the greatest spectacle humanity has ever witnessed. And when I left there, I knew I could never talk about it. But now, after so many years, I feel like people deserve to know. It was all a carefully planned lie, executed with surgical precision to fool the entire world. After months immersed in the Lunar Light Project and the operations of Area 14, I began to realize something that, at the time, seemed surreal. Not all astronauts were what they seemed to be. One of my tasks was to monitor the rehearsals of the simulated broadcasts. Whenever Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, or Michael Collins appeared on set, they were accompanied by other men dressed in identical spacesuits. These other men rarely spoke, and when they did, their voices did not match the astronauts' known personalities. At first, I thought they were stunt doubles for auditions, but I soon realized there was something more going on. I remember one specific day during a test recording. One of the supervisors, clearly angry, interrupted the simulation and shouted, "Where's the real Neil? We need him to record the lines." What intrigued me was the response from one of the extras, who calmly said, "It doesn't matter who is in the costume. With the visor down, no one can tell who we are." These words stuck in my head for a long time. As time passed, it became clear that these men were trained to replace the astronauts on recordings. They repeated the same movements and dialogues until everything was perfect. I later discovered that their voices would be replaced in the final edit to match those of the real astronauts. Off-camera interactions were also awkward. One of the extras, who we called John, said something to me that made me uncomfortable. "They need us because real astronauts can't do it alone. They know how to fly a ship, but they don't know how to act." I laughed nervously, but he looked serious. One day, while doing maintenance on the audio system, I picked up a conversation that I wasn't supposed to hear. Two men were arguing about the difficulty of keeping the story consistent. One said, If anyone asks how Neil and Buzz took such perfect photos, tell them the camera was stuck in the suit. It doesn't matter if it makes sense. The public won't question it. Another notable incident occurred during a break in rehearsals. One of the real astronauts, and I won't say which one, looked frustrated. He said in a low voice to another team member, "I didn't sign up for this. We were trained to go to the moon, not to lie to the world." The other replied, "You are doing this for your country. It's either that or the humiliation of losing to the Russians." These moments revealed the duality of what was happening. On one side, there was a public narrative of courage, innovation, and achievement. On the other, there was a controlled operation where men trained to be heroes were in part transformed into actors in a carefully choreographed show. I later discovered that there were additional contracts signed by the astronauts, contracts that guaranteed absolute confidentiality regarding any simulation carried out during the mission. An engineer next to me explained, "They are the face of the project. If one of them opens his mouth, the whole castle will collapse." The presence of the extras, the rehearsed lines, and the constant concern with the perfection of the images reinforced what I already feared. The Apollo 11 mission was much more about performance than exploration. Those men were heroes, yes, but maybe not in the way everyone thinks. Even today, when I see the images of the American flag fluttering or the impeccable footprints on the lunar soil, I remember the extras and the tireless rehearsals I watched. And I wonder, if it wasn't always Neil or Buzz on the recordings, then who was really there? Or better said, was someone really there? As time passed, I began to understand that the objective of the Lunar Light Project was not only to create convincing images, but also to fabricate evidence that reinforced the narrative. And that's when I became aware of something they called the fictitious Lunar Department. It was a small, isolated, and highly secretive team tasked with creating physical evidence that could be used to validate the Apollo 11 mission. One day, I was called to do a technical inspection in a restricted area within Area 14. There, I saw something that I will never forget, a series of soil samples that were supposedly from the moon. But these samples were being manufactured right there in an underground laboratory. I saw scientists mixing minerals, simulating the extreme radiation and pressure conditions these stones would face in space. One of the scientists told me, almost accidentally, "The composition needs to be perfect. We need to fool even the best geologists." In the same laboratory, there were detailed models of equipment that would be left on the moon, such as the lunar reflector and instruments for measuring solar radiation. The most intriguing thing was that these items were already artificially aged. A technician explained to me that a worn appearance was essential to convey authenticity. "We can't send something that looks new," he joked, but the tone in his voice didn't hide the discomfort. The biggest shock came when I discovered how these items would be planted on the moon. An engineer who worked on unmanned missions told me, "The robotic probes we sent before Apollo already took some of these things. All we're doing now is validating their presence with the streams you helped create." It was as if the mission was already completed before it even began. One night, while working late, I overheard a conversation between two scientists about how to handle potential questions from the public. They discussed ways to explain inconsistencies in the data or samples. One suggested, if someone says the rocks look different than they expect, just claim that the moon has unique conditions that alter the mineral composition. They have no way of objecting. Later, when the Apollo missions began to return supposed lunar samples, I remembered the boxes I saw being sealed in Area 14. The labeling was meticulous, as if it were intended for real trips, but the destinations indicated were not the moon. They were laboratories at different universities and research institutes around the world. These samples would be distributed to selected scientists who would use them as a basis for validating the authenticity of the mission. What disturbed me most was the fact that even communications were manipulated. On one occasion, I witnessed a technician adjusting radio recordings to create interference and delays, simulating the distance between the Earth and the Moon. He casually commented, "The signals have to look real. We can't let them think this came from a studio." The operation was so thorough that it even included adjustments to the scientific data that would be presented to the public. I remember a briefing where it was discussed how to present lunar radiation levels in a way that appeared authentic, but without raising concerns that the astronauts might have been exposed to deadly doses. The culmination of this fabrication of evidence came when a senior official visited the facility and inspected the laboratory. He was impressed with the quality of the samples and said, "Good job, gentlemen. With this, not even the Russians will be able to question our achievement." It was a proud moment for some, but for me, it was the final confirmation that it was all a big hoax. To this day, when I see lunar samples displayed in museums or hear scientists talk about data from the Apollo missions, I can't help but feel uneasy, because I know that the tests that the world admires were created here on Earth by a small group of people who had one mission: to deceive the world and guarantee the victory of the United States in the space race. Over time, it became evident that the control of information within Project Lunar Light was almost as impressive as the operation itself. Everything that happened was kept under extreme secrecy, and any attempt to question or challenge the narrative was quickly crushed. That's when I realized that NASA had a well-structured system to silence anyone who posed a threat to the secret. I remember a colleague named Frank, a talented engineer who worked on the navigation system for the Apollo missions. He was skeptical from the beginning and made no bones about hiding his doubts. During a meeting, he raised the question, "If this is all training, why are we spending so much time creating visual materials? This doesn't make sense for a real mission." The room fell silent, and the supervisor quickly ended the conversation with a harsh tone. "You are here to do as we say, not to question orders." A few weeks later, Frank was reassigned to a smaller, irrelevant project, far from any contact with main operations. Not long after, he disappeared. I asked another colleague what had happened, and he just shook his head, saying he knew too much and talked too much. They don't tolerate it. There was a constant feeling that we were being watched. Cameras were installed in every hallway, and our conversations were frequently interrupted by supervisors who insisted that we stay focused on work. On more than one occasion, I saw colleagues being called into private meetings after asking questions about the true purpose of the project. When they returned, they were visibly tense and never brought up the subject again. One case in particular left a deep impression on me. A technician named Sam, responsible for adjusting the audio systems for simulated broadcasts, confided in me that he had seen recordings showing astronauts training in front of what appeared to be a false background. He said, "This isn't training for the moon. This is something much darker." The next day, he didn't show up for work. I asked a supervisor about him, and the answer was straightforward. "Sam is no longer part of the team. Don't ask questions." The control measures did not stop there. All employees were required to undergo regular security checks, which included intimidating interviews with federal agents. I was once called into one of these meetings and asked about a conversation I had with a colleague over lunch. They wanted to know if I had discussed the project outside the restricted area. I denied it, but the fact that they knew about the conversation made me paranoid. They were listening to everything. The culmination of this control came when rumors began to circulate about an information leak. They said that a technician had taken photos of the film set and sent them to a journalist. I don't know if that was true, but the reaction was immediate. Supervisors carried out a thorough sweep of the site, confiscating equipment and personally searching all employees. After that, we never heard from that coach again. There was also a darker side. Some rumors suggested that those who persisted in questioning or threatened to expose the project faced more serious consequences than just losing their jobs. One of the most disturbing stories involved a scientist who allegedly tried to contact an investigative reporter. He died in a car accident a few days later. Many believed it was no coincidence. This environment of fear and absolute control made me understand that we were dealing with something much bigger than a simple lunar mission. It wasn't just NASA that was involved. There were other entities, government agencies and power groups, ensuring that this secret was maintained at all costs. Sometimes I wonder how many people around the world began to suspect this story, but were discouraged or silenced before they were able to do anything about it. Because one thing is certain: no one was above the system. He was ruthless, and those who tried to stand up to him paid the price. Over the years I worked at NASA, I witnessed many uncomfortable moments, but none were as disturbing as the confession I heard from one of the astronauts involved in the Apollo missions. It was a moment that left a deep impression on me and still makes me question the limits of what a human being is capable of enduring in the name of his country. It was a night like any other in Area 14. We were finalizing the final adjustments on a simulated transmission when I noticed that one of the astronauts was sitting alone in a corner, visibly shaken. He was a figure admired by all, a true American hero. I approached hesitantly and asked if he was okay. He looked up at me, and what I saw was a heavy look, full of guilt and despair. After a few seconds of silence, he said, "Have you ever wondered why we are practicing so much here but never talk about the real mission?" I didn't know what to answer. He continued, "We will never go to the moon. This is all a lie." I was speechless. He began to unburden himself, speaking in a low voice as if he was afraid someone was listening. "We are not trained to lie. We were trained to explore. When I joined this program, I thought I was about to make history, to take a step for all of humanity. But all we are doing here is deceiving. And the worst thing is that I have no choice. They told me that if I don't cooperate, it will be seen as treason." He talked about the endless rehearsals in the desert, about how the pressure to appear authentic was destroying his psyche. "People will call us heroes, but I know the truth. I know the whole world will believe in something that never happened, and I will have to carry this burden for the rest of my life." What shocked me the most was when he mentioned that he wasn't the only one who felt this way. The others know too, but everyone deals with it differently. Some convince themselves that they are doing this for the country, for American superiority. Others just don't talk about it. It's like a silent pact. Before he gets up and out, he told me something that was recorded in my mind forever. One day, maybe the truth comes out. Maybe someone has the courage to tell the world what really happened. But I will not be me. I can't risk my family, my life. I just hope that when this happens, people understand that we did what we did because we thought it was the best for our country. At that moment, I realized that the weight of the farce was not only about technicians, engineers, and scientists, but also about those who were on the front line, those who would become the faces and voices of this lie. They were as prisoners of this system as us. In the following days, I noticed that he seemed even more distant. During the simulations, his performance was impeccable, but behind the scenes, he was crumbling. On one occasion, I heard him arguing with a supervisor. He said, "You are asking us to lie to the world. This is not fair." The supervisor answered coldly, "You committed yourself. Now do your part." Looking back, I wonder how many times he wished he could go back, refuse, expose the truth. But the system was relentless. There was no room for regrets or doubts. Those who questioned were silenced, or, as in the case of this astronaut, forced to carry a weight that no one should have to bear. To this day, When I see your face in documentaries or history books, I feel a mixture of admiration and sadness. He will always be remembered as a hero, but I know that behind that smile, there was a truth he could never tell. Years after leaving NASA, I still carry the scars of everything I lived. With each news, documentary, or historical landing on the moon, I feel a mix of frustration, guilt, and impotence. I know that for most people, Apollo 11 mission is a symbol of courage and progress, but for me, it is a reminder of how the truth can be manipulated to serve political and geopolitical interests. After all I witnessed, the meticulous desert tests, the manufacture of evidence, the astronaut extras, and the devastating confession of a true hero, there is no doubt that the landing on the 1969 moon has never happened. It was an elaborate scam, carefully orchestrated to design the US power and supremacy during the Cold War. What disturbs me most is the reach of this operation. It was not just a staging, it was a global illusion supported by a network of lies, threats, and absolute control. The people who participated in this scheme were not villains, but victims of a system larger than them, a system that used patriotism and fear to justify their actions. I remember a colleague telling me, the day I finished my last task in NASA, "Tom, you will carry it with you forever. They can erase tapes, destroy documents, and silence people, but they will never erase what you know." He was right. Decades have passed, but the details of that operation are still alive in my memory. The question I ask myself is, what would happen if the world discovered the truth? How would people react to knowing that the greatest achievement of humanity was, in fact, the biggest lie in history? Perhaps the answer is exactly the reason why everything was kept secret. The shock would be devastating, not only to the United States, but to our own perception of progress, science, and exploitation. Today, while I write this, I know I'm risking my safety, but I can't be silent anymore. Humanity deserves to know the truth, even if this truth is difficult to accept. And more importantly, it deserves to learn from it so that future generations will never be manipulated in this way. If you have arrived here, I hope this story aroused your curiosity and leads you to question everything that has been told. After all, as one of my supervisors said in the project Light Luna, the truth is out there, but only finds it who really looks for it. Now the decision is in your hands. Will you believe what has always been told, or will start investigating for yourself? The choice is yours.